Greetings from Seattle, Washington. My name is Christopher Hanson, and I'm so glad that you could join me today for this 20-minute session on what are we teaching teachers? Today, we're talking about the opportunity we have to reimagine inclusivity in art education and how we prepare future educators. Specifically, I wanted to present an autoethnography of my experiences preparing to teach what I like to call the course, this opportunity that not every university has to specifically engage future educators and what it means to serve all students in the art classroom. To set the stage a little bit, I wanted to talk about my structure for this course and what I specifically went through teaching it in this past year amidst the global pandemic. I'll talk about the structure, and that's the syllabus that I designed specifically, some of the foundational elements that I wanted to bring into the course before we got into specific conversations about laws or accommodations, 504, IEP, particular populations, laying down a framework that would allow us to appreciate all of the context of what we do in the classroom. I'm going to talk about understanding what it is that we do specifically from a music education standpoint, the pedagogical possibilities that exist when we look at some of the learning and teaching theories that are all over the literature, but how we can actually use them practically within our classroom to support good pedagogy. The importance of advocacy, thanks to the wonderful work of Charles Fowler, the significance and risk that we run by not teaching every student, thanks to the incredible and lasting work of John Dewey. And lastly, opportunities and needs for collaboration, particularly with music therapists that are out in the field. So throughout this, my goal is to really encourage everyone that participates, whether you're a school administrator, a practicing teacher, a future educator, or a teacher of teachers, critical perspective is always valuable. With that, I also want to make sure that we have a pragmatic application. So this is one of my favorite cartoons that I share with students to explain pragmatism versus idealism, which is something I think a lot of new teachers can suffer. So here we have this small character saying, dude, I have so many ideas that would revolutionize life on Earth and bring awesomeness to mankind. While the other cartoon character is saying, how about you just take out the garbage and do the dishes for once? Now, without this being some sort of a generational jab, I think really what it's showing is that there are practical, real life things that can be applied in our teaching and our everyday life that do bring joy and do bring change in context to those that are in our community. In this case, it's probably a father looking at his son, hoping that he would just do some chores. But in reality, we want to have this idealism. We want to know that there's a possibility to change and improve and alter the world through our teaching and through our engagement with our students. At the same time, we need to make sure that it's practical and real and utilizes the resources that we have without leaning too hard into idealism and setting us up for failure to truly serve all of our students. Everything that I talk about today is fueled by reflexivity and lived personal and professional experiences. That being specifically my experiences in preparing and teaching this course to prepare future educators, but also in general, the ideas that you bring to this session are most important. In fact, paramount to you being able to practice critical reflexivity and finding pragmatic ways that you can better serve your students and future educators. So let me set the stage specifically about what this last year looked like. It was my first year teaching at the college level. I am so blessed to have a position at Seattle Pacific University where I serve as the Director of Music Education and Orchestral Activities. Prior to that, I'd been teaching 8 years in secondary instrumental music in Central Texas, taught middle school and high school, and right before I left, I had established a 5th grade strings program. So primarily secondary school instrumental instruction. I was a non-traditional certification in the state of Texas. This means a little something different in every state, but for Texas, it meant that I did not complete my certification with my bachelor's degree. Rather, I received my bachelor's degree, ended up going to grad school, did a lot of work with community music programs and after-school programs, and then made the decision that I wanted to go ahead and teach in public school. So because I had a bachelor's degree and had experience, the state of Texas deemed me as highly qualified. So I was able to get an emergency certificate, go into the classroom and start teaching right away. And then on that certificate, I was on probation and completed it in my first year, and then was a fully certified teacher, K through 12 general music in the state of Texas. Coming from the classroom, one of the big battles that I faced in trying to teach teachers is wade through what I call the theory versus practice dilemma, where a lot of the books and resources that we have are phenomenal. The scholarship that's happening in the academic world around special populations, differentiation, accommodations, using the arts to serve all students better is phenomenal. But for a pre-service teacher, particularly pre-service art, or in this case, music teacher, this can be incredibly overwhelming. And the theory is wonderful, but again, looking at it pragmatically, how can we put it into practice? I wanted to make sure that my experience is translated to my students and ultimately to you in this 20 minutes as something that you could utilize right away. I did have the opportunity to reimagine what I was doing with my music ed students. So my program had just started a new degree plan, a new Bachelor's of Arts plan that was approved through the National Association for Schools of Music. So this was a great opportunity. On top of that, we have the only music therapy program in the state of Washington, which was significant because I have learned that most schools that offer some sort of a class on engaging in special education programs or differentiation or accommodations within the art classroom are usually offering that class because they have a music therapy program. Music therapists are required to take a course like this. And so where you see a music therapy program, you usually see a course preparing students to teach all students. Outside of that, it usually gets relegated to a seminar or a brief anecdote or an article that students will read to prepare them. In my own experiences as a non-traditional teacher, I had a PowerPoint, a 2-hour session that was facilitated online where I learned all of the jargon. I learned about 504s and IEPs and accommodations. And it was interesting and it was valuable because they were words that I was going to use in the field, but it didn't really have hold in my classroom. It didn't translate to how I should be structuring my curriculum and changing my instruction to serve all of my students. So I wanted to make sure that even though this is a course that is being offered because of our music therapy program, that it really spoke to every student that was in it. It was not just music therapy students, but music ed majors and special education majors that were all a part of this class. Now, of course, I was teaching it during a global pandemic, which means it was completely online. So trying to navigate that did prove some unique challenges, as I'm sure a lot of you have faced. But outside of that, I think the content that we achieved and the structure we achieved, which I'll outline in a second, was really the greatest part of being able to do this class in such a grace-filled environment as everyone was trying to navigate this past spring with a lot of grace. Lastly, in terms of setting the stage, I am on a quarter system. So this also poses some unique situations. Rather than being on semesters, we have 4 quarters that span the whole year, which are usually 10-week calendars to be able to facilitate the teaching and finals week. Because of the pandemic and an extended spring break to prepare for that unique quarter, we actually only had 8 weeks of instruction. So everything that we did went really fast, as you could imagine. So let's talk about the structure. These are just some snippets from the actual syllabus that I was providing. So the course, again, was facilitated completely online. And before I came into the program, the description that we had for the course was this. This course centers on methods and materials for using music and related arts with children who have special needs. Students will observe on-site classes with special music specialists in the Seattle area. This course is designed for special education, and music therapy students. Some of you can probably identify already that there are some pitfalls in this description, in that it talks about using music and related arts with children who have special needs, but it doesn't talk about those students actually learning through those experiences. It also talks about on-site observations, which we were not able to accommodate because of the pandemic. So I wanted to look at this in a new and creative way. The course was titled Music in Special Education. And so I proposed some changes that I was very grateful the university was able to adopt. So now we call the course Making Music with Diverse Learners. And the description is now designed to explore and promote inclusive instruction in music for diverse learners. This course identifies the needs and explores the accommodations available to support the engagement and learning of all students in a music classroom. The goal was to make this definition more inclusive and promote the idea of the exploration of more information that is needed to better serve students. So in terms of resources, and forgive me, there's a long list here because I recognize there wasn't one book to rule them all. We had a book that was adopted specifically for our music therapy students. Some of you might be familiar with, and this is the Music and Special Education. It's written by 2 board-certified music therapists. It's a phenomenal resource, but really does focus a lot on music therapy and offering accommodations to students in public school settings. But I recognized there was so much more that was out there that I wanted the students to experience. Now, I only asked students to buy Music and Special Education, but all of the other resources that are listed, I was able to choose specific chapters or specific sections to be able to use in the course. And I'm going to show you how I utilized them throughout this presentation. In terms of course objectives, I wanted you to see that I have specifically chosen cognitive verbs that promoted the idea of examination, of survey, of discussion, and then ultimately I wanted them to create products that they could use in the field. So the last learning objective is what I consider the most important. Research, organize, write, and present a professional statement of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, most of these learning objectives are things that are probably already a part of a course that you teach or that you've experienced, but this last one to me was the most significant. Now we are at a time more than ever where advocacy is crucial to our success and our students' success. So I wanted to make sure that there was an opportunity for students to generate something that they could use in the field to promote inclusivity, to promote differentiation. And so one of the final products of this course was this professional statement for diversity, equity, and inclusion. In terms of assessments, I had sort of a typical reading assessments, lecture reflections, but I also wanted to force these students to practice critical reflexivity themselves. I had them develop their own philosophy of music, and I asked them to interview professionals in the field that were engaging with the arts in a way that they aspired to after they graduated. The summative assessments to me were the most important. I wanted an annotated resource list so that they could grow the resources that they would have to better serve their students, an advocacy statement that they could share with administrators or community leaders for the programs they were leading, and then again, as mentioned, a professional statement of diversity, equity, and inclusion. This was a big one to promote the idea of advocacy and prepare our students to be able to have those conversations in the field. So now that you have a little bit of the structure, let's talk about foundations. In order to do this, I started with Ellen Nottbaum's extraordinary work, 10 Things Your Student with Autism Wishes You Knew. Now, a lot of you are probably familiar with this work. What I decided to do was have my students read the introduction to the book that identifies 10 things that Ellen Nottbaum recognized her students wanted her to know when she was engaged in teaching students on the autism spectrum. And I had the students reflect upon this and talk about their experiences being in school, their experiences working with or for students on the autism spectrum. And it was an incredible way to ground people to recognize that this is not about learning tricks. This is not about building tools or repertoire in order for you to quote unquote deal with students, in this case on the autism spectrum or any students or people with special needs. This was about humanizing our students and our engagement with the arts, but knowing that we're teaching human beings in front of us, not an ideal student, not a problem to be solved, but recognizing that the needs of all students are similar and or the same, that they want to be engaged, that they want to trust you, that they want you to see them for who they are, not as a broken or a set of missing parts. Right? These statements that Ellen Nottbaum offers are just so powerful. And this was the very first activity we did in the class. After that, I encouraged the students to dive into the philosophy of music. If we're going to use music or the arts to engage students and human beings in learning, I think we need to know what it is. So I pulled some significant quotes from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on their article talking specifically about music. These are things that I thought were powerful for the students to consider as they built their own philosophy of music. Philosophy of music is the study of fundamental questions about the nature and value of music and our experience of it. The philosophy of music is a practice most people have significant background in merely as a result of being members of a musical culture. Music is perhaps the art that represents the most philosophical puzzle. Interpretation of music points to the fact that we find music and art steeped with meaning, and yet, unlike drama, pure instrumental music has no obvious semantic content. And central to many philosophers' thinking has been music's apparent ability to express emotions while remaining an abstract art in some sense. So all of these are quotes taken from this article on music, and I wanted the students to recognize the beauty of the subjectivity and the significance of the abstractness of music, that these sounds have somehow been organized in a way to elicit emotion and to get us to view the world in a unique way. How could they use this to better teach students with special needs? So let's actually talk about what we do in the classroom. Now, this was a big chunk of the course, particularly because I was working with music therapists that had not studied a lot of pedagogy. A huge resource that I utilize in an introduction to music therapy course is this book by Birch Browning, An Orientation to Musical Pedagogy. These are some significant quotes that drove us through this past quarter. One of the continuing challenges to music education is the perception by members of the general public and education administrators that music and the arts in general are extras rather than core subjects in the curriculum. And justifying music with its benefits to students and schools outside the arts classroom, we fail to support music as an indispensable because these benefits can be obtained through other educational efforts. Birch Browning is a huge advocate for the arts, and he articulates things so well. He goes from this advocacy statement to then talking about the practical idea of music as subject matter and what that means. The recent challenge has been to make those implicit understandings explicit and to marry together research about music learning, music education philosophy, and music education policy in order to communicate the value of music study to the general public and to advocate with educational and governmental decision makers for continuing financial support of music study. So how can we do that? One way is being effective communicators. And Birch Browning does an interesting thing. He says we need to use more educational jargon. We need to find those things that bring us together. One term that we should all be familiar with is Bloom's taxonomy. The structure of Bloom's work in psychology to be able to talk about how the brain works at different levels is something we've all arguably experienced, whether it was formally or informally within the classroom. But something I think we miss is that Bloom developed other taxonomies. So we need to think about the psychomotor and the affective domains of human learning as well. This is where we really get into the whole structure of what Bloom wanted to communicate, and that the mind controls the body, and that how the mind is thinking about the learning experience dramatically affects learning. In terms of its benefits, a firm understanding of the taxonomy provides the common terminology, a kind of factual knowledge that enables communication with educators and other disciplines to explain the value of music education. Now, these are Birch Browning's words, but again, it plays into the idea of using arts and education for advocacy of serving all students. If we have this jargon with us, if we learn about the psychological aspects of human learning and how the arts benefit that, we have more ammunition to be able to fight for our students. And we can use this as a common language with administrators and community leaders in educational settings. Now, I want to breeze over this relatively quickly because for some of you that might not specifically be in music, the context of this slide is to make sure that you know the history of what it is that you're doing. So we went over the history of music and public schools. We specifically talked about the standards. Starting way back in 1983 when A Nation at Risk was published, we recognized the need for more standards. Now coming out of the 80s and the end of the 70s when we had this accountability movement, we know that this is when we start establishing standardized tests. And so this can be arguably a good thing in terms of accountability measures, but a really challenging thing in terms of developing and nurture curriculum with our students and making sure that arts are part of a full and rounded education. As things matured through the 80s into the 90s, the National Association for Music Education became a part of the conversation about creating standards-based practices and learning and teaching within public schools. They did generate a core subject under the federal law of the Goals 2000 initiative, which meant that art was a part of the core curriculum in the United States. This was an initiative started in the 90s and passed in as a part of their Goals 2000. And then they created the opportunity in 2004 or 2006 to revisit the standards that were established in the 90s. And in 2014, they published, in coalition with the National Council for Core Arts Standards, a new set of standards that specifically talked about the process of creating art rather than products for creating art. Some of you, again, might already be familiar with this. This is creating, performing, presenting, or producing, depending on what art medium you're utilizing, responding, and connecting. This was huge because this, again, pushed us into the process and growth model that art education allows us to have, rather than just being driven by product, by performances, by gallery walks. This was not just about what you produced, but how you were growing through making art. This is a wonderful pictograph of what it looks like and how they break these different standards up. This is available through the National Core Arts Standards. If you've not visited that website, I strongly encourage it, especially for those of you that are advocates for the arts and education. There are only 11 anchor standards. It can become rather dense from a pedagogical standpoint, but the organization of this to promote growth model in learning is something that is new and innovative and very applicable to 21st century skills and teaching in the classroom. Now, knowing what it is that we do in the classroom is sort of the first aspect of it. Now we need to think about the pedagogical possibilities of having a philosophy, thinking about advocacy, knowing what the practice demands of us in terms of standards and accountability, but now looking at what that means on a day-to-day basis. What are the pedagogical possibilities? For this, I borrowed from an incredible book called Teaching for Musical Understanding by Jackie Wiggins. She used a lot of psychological research to support her findings. These are some quotes I thought were significant. It is important to understand that learners will enter any learning situation from their own perspective, rooted in their own prior experience. Lesson design must enable individual learners with different levels of expertise to participate in the same experience. Learners should be able to participate from a wide variety of entry points along a continuum of competence. And here I provided a little graph of the learning cycle that a lot of you are probably familiar with, that idea of experience, reflection, conceptualization, and then experiment, leading back to an experience that we can reflect upon and continue to grow with and ultimately learn. So what's interesting is that Wiggins brings in this concept of learners requiring agency. To be willing and able to enter a learning situation, learners must have a sense of personal agency. That is, a belief in themselves, a sense that they have the capacity to engage, initiate, and intentionally influence their life circumstances. Now, this was a quote that works from Albert Bandura's work that deals a lot with self-efficacy and agency. And I put a Seymour Papert quote in here as well to promote the significance of this, the idea that it's less us and more them, creating student-centered context for learning. Papert wrote, "I think it's an exaggeration, but that there's a lot of truth in saying that when you go to school, the trauma is that you must stop learning and you must now accept being taught." So what does that mean in terms of learner agency? Wiggins continues, "The role of teacher as more knowledgeable other and the institutionalization of formal education is in our society give teachers a degree of power. In a social constructivist learning teaching setting, the relationship between learner and teacher is central to the process of learning. With this process, teachers' way of being and frame for interacting with learners determine the nature of this relationship. Power can rear its head even in the gentlest of classrooms when teachers unknowingly and unintentionally assert control through decisions they make during lesson and design and execution. This is the big one. We have to be willing to let learners be more autonomous and get our own ideas out of the way, making space for their ideas." This is incredibly controversial in a lot of art classrooms, and when talking about what we do and looking at standards-based models that are rooted in a history that's based on product and performance, we become very objective about meeting standards, the note is in tune or it's not in tune, that shape is correct or not correct, that dance move was executed or not executed. Here we're looking at a social constructivist perspective in which the student is in control of a lot of the art that they engage with, which then alters their experience and their learning. This is a big block quote that I wanted to include from Wiggins. And again, this is from her Teaching for Musical Understanding, that I think does a great job of summing up this concept of social constructivism in art education. In a productive music learning community, individuals take responsibility for their own learning and also for their peers. The more experience that participants have working together, the higher the level of mutual understanding among community members. Teaching music from this perspective turns a classroom, rehearsal hall, or studio into an interactive community of learners that shares experience, thinks together, is concerned for its members, supports its members, strives together to understand more and achieve at higher levels together, and celebrates individual and shared achievement. The teacher also plays many important roles, of course, but as a member of the community, not as the one in charge. The teacher does have more experience and expertise and therefore serves as a resource, a guide, a mentor, a provider of support, even a manager, but the teacher is also a learner, learning about and from the learner's perspectives, learning from what they know about music and learning what they need to support their learning. Now, who wouldn't want this classroom? From my perspective, this should define exactly what it is that we hope to achieve for all of our students and for our peers, our colleagues as educators. But unfortunately, speaking from my own experience, this is not necessarily what we're seeing. It's not something that I necessarily achieved in my first few years. It took dialogue and conversation and advocacy for me to better understand my role as an educator and the importance that the arts played in serving all students in their learning. So let's talk about this. The importance of advocacy, I tried to communicate with my students through the work of Charles Fowler. He has an incredible book that was published posthumously with all of the works that he published. This is a Charles Fowler reader, and in the part 5, he specifically talks about diversity and pluralism in art education. I wanted the students to walk away from this course knowing that there is more to serving all students than just accommodating students in special education programs. There's more to all students than just IEPs or 504s or an autism spectrum. It is trying to get to everyone. What Fowler provides is a series of chapters and articles that he's written about different populations. And this was really just to disambiguate this idea that special education is the only place in which students are served best. We need to make it a standard that all students are served equitably. And this challenged the students to reimagine who their students might be and the different populations that they could engage with. In terms of significance and risk, I had to bring in John Dewey, and this comes from an incredible book called Teaching Music to Students with Special Needs. There are some great quotes that come out of it, but specifically I wanted to take this quote from John Dewey, who says, in order to have a large numbers of values in common, all members of the group must have equable opportunity to receive and to take from others. There must be a large variety of shared undertakings and experiences. Otherwise, the influences which educate some into masters educate others into slaves. Educators are now challenged to expect achievement from all of their students, regardless of their background or relative strength in areas of challenge. And Dewey promoted democratic education, but I think now more than ever we can understand the significance of that, of how unequal opportunity now becomes a risk of not being able to serve our students equitably, but ultimately stifling the opportunities that they have to grow through the arts. So where are the opportunities for collaboration? Very quickly, I reference back to Albert Bandura. This is a great quote from him who says, in order to succeed, people need a sense of self-efficacy, to struggle together, a resilience to meet the inevitable obstacles and inequities that we have in life. So we're really thinking about finding ways to collaborate with other service members in education. We're going back to human agency and concluding these thoughts. We can think about the prescriptive traditional models that are being replaced by active, reflexive approaches that focus on individuals' desires both within and beyond the therapy room. Now, this is taken from a book that focuses on music therapy and practices in music education, but it starts to call for what is a bigger goal is to communicate and collaborate with service members in the field of education. The last book that we looked at in the year, the one that was required, was Music in Special Education, that spoke specifically to our music therapy students. But we started to talk about that opportunity for collaboration, how we can all come together to better serve all of our students. Even though the student engages in music learning differently with music therapists, and they're looking to advance and challenge themselves to meeting incredible cognitive, behavioral, and physical, emotional, social goals that are established in their IEPs, we can still look at how that can be supported as music educators and not just relegate that work to music therapists. Everyone is a part of this. When we're talking about mainstreaming and inclusion, again, the role of the music educator should continue to evolve, beginning with the practice of mainstreaming in the 1970s and pushing us into this classroom in which we are not just thinking about accommodations, but we're thinking about serving all students with and in collaboration with others. So what is the goal for you to leave with today? What did I want you to walk away with? Number one, I hope you have some resources to help facilitate courses like this. I hope that you've gained an understanding of what critical perspective of teaching, learning, practicing, and performing music, in this case, or the arts means, definitions and understandings of diverse learners and how to serve them, a philosophical and moral foundation for advocacy of inclusive teaching in the arts, and then a confidence to change the world. And this is a quote that I share with all of my students from Maxine Green. The arts, it has been said, cannot change the world, but they may change human beings who might change the world. These were the learning goals that I left my students with at the end of the quarter, and something that I hope you're leaving with today. we have the opportunity to advocate for all pre-service teachers to have this type of training, to think critically and reflexively on their own practices and experiences, and ultimately use the arts to be able to serve all students with dignity and equity. I hope that you enjoyed this session. My contact information is available, and I would love to hear from you if you would like to have a copy of my syllabus or would like any additional resources that I shared in this presentation. I hope you enjoyed this conference, and I thank you for being a part of this presentation and the incredible work that you are undoubtedly doing to serve all of our students through the arts.